Spadina, meaning a place on a hill. This site was also part of an important trail for several First Nations. As an institution committed to promoting truth and reconciliation, we note this history and we wish to honor these connections as we move forward collectively. So tonight, we are here to welcome the 2026 Michael Hough OALA Visiting Critic in Landscape Architecture, Dr. Jala Makhzoumi. And I have the double honor of welcoming you as the director of the MLA program, but also as the Daniels Faculty Appointed Educator to the Ontario Association of Landscape Architects, also known as the OALA, and the sponsor of tonight's event. This annual award honors Michael Hough and his approach to landscape architecture and planning, which was grounded in urban ecology and aimed to connect the city with nature, both integrally but also visibly. This lecture is made possible by the generous support of the OALA. Back in 2003, they first established this endowment at the faculty to enrich the academic experience of students in our Master of Landscape Architecture and other programs. The OALA's continued support enables our students to benefit from the insights and creativity of outstanding visiting professors, practitioners, and critics operating in the field of landscape architecture. So I'd like to thank all of the OALA members in the audience tonight, including Jane Welsh, Carolyn Woodland, and also the sincerest welcome to Bridget Hough and the Hough family, who again have made this endowment possible in honor of Michael. With your support, we're able to have Dr. Jala Makhzoumi join us, and tonight we're going to hear her talk entitled Unravelling a Colonial Legacy, Grounding Landscape Architecture. And following that, we'll have an opportunity to ask questions. So Jala joins us from the American University of Beirut, where she's an adjunct professor in landscape architecture. She's the acting president of the International Federation of Landscape Architects, Middle East region, and the 2021 laureate of IFLA's Sir Geoffrey Jellicoe Award for her outstanding contribution to education and practice. In her practice, teaching and research, Jala pioneers an ecological design approach that promotes grounded and community-inclusive landscapes. Her expertise includes landscape heritage conservation, post-war recovery, and sustainable urban greening. Her most recent publication is a volume she co-authors entitled Landscape Architecture in the Arab Middle East. And in this publication, landscape architecture is described as a relatively new profession in the Arab Middle East, but within a regional landscape that one of the oldest continually inhabited in the world. And a challenge to this profession in this context is the translation of the word landscape from its Western origins. The meaning of the word is often simplified to an idea of natural scenery, prioritizing aesthetics and beautification over social, cultural, and ecological concerns. So this evening, we're going to have the great opportunity to hear about how Jala has spent her entire career overcoming these associations, what she refers to as landscape's colonial legacy. She'll share how she has used her practice, research, and teaching to ground landscape architecture in regional ecology, as well as the needs and aspirations of local communities. So let's all welcome Dr. Jala Makhzoumi.
Thank you, Elise. Lovely. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Elise, for this lovely introduction. And my thanks go to the Daniels faculty and to Elise and OLA for making my visit possible. It is really an honor to be here talking to you. And it is a double honor because it's associated with Michael Hough, who was one of the first scholars whose book I read when I was doing my PhD. And it had a lasting influence on the work that I had, because Hough, working also with McCarg, at the time in the 70s and 80s, were truly pioneers, because they they looked to ecological sciences and ecology to enhance, shift mainstream practice away from the pursuit of aesthetics and functionality towards something much more integrated and grounded. I too found ecology when I started my career in landscape architecture in Iraq more than 40 years ago, and then I really didn't know what landscape was, much more than it was about open spaces, and I didn't know the profession. There was no internet to find out, and I was practicing in a professional void. The profession was totally absent from the region then, and is still emerging. So in today's talk, what I will do, I will draw on my practice and my teaching to talk about this new discovery of mine, the colonial legacy, landscape's colonial legacy, to unpack this overlap between landscape and the colonial project. And then I will talk about how do you go around this legacy through grounded immersion, immersive learning. And then I will cite one project from Lebanon to show how it all comes together. So let me start by looking, so landscape's colonial legacy, there are two legacies really. There's landscape, the legacy that is a metaphor. And this is what I will start with. And then I'll move to landscape that is not a metaphor, but a reality, the colonial legacy. In a nutshell, landscape is about the relationship of a community to the environment they inhabit. So it is about the relationship, and the product is landscape. Landscapes are tangible, spatial, something we see and feel, but landscape is also embraces values and conceptions of what we see. So we shape the environment, and the environment in turn, the landscape created, shapes us and our values. So it's a very, very dynamic kind of concept. But landscape as a word, the English word, has gone through a very long historical trajectory. It started in Northern Europe, meaning a part of the countryside with woodlands and cultivation and so on. Then it was appropriated by artists who made out of landscape a genre of painting, and that meaning has persisted more than any other, the pictorial meaning of landscape. Geographers saw in landscape the characteristics of a region or a place. Cultural or human geography looked at cultural landscapes, or landscape as an expression of culture. Ecologists adopted the name. Karl Troll in 1930 used landscape because he was fed up with the abstract path that ecology was taking. So he wanted to root landscape ecology, the ecosystem, which is again the relationship between a community and its environment, in a specific place and region. So he founded the science of landscape ecology. Archaeologists, anthropologists, political sciences have all adopted the word landscape. So in a sense, it's a very layered meaning, and it's a very rich concept that we're dealing with. I moved to colonial legacy. Now, yesterday I also spoke here to another class, and we spoke about colonialism. I mean, European colonialism is not the first Romans colonized, Ottomans colonized, a lot of empires before them, but none at the scale of European colonization, as you can see from the map. So European colonization is a fundamentally spatial approach, an imperial project aimed to reclaim and rethink the history and agency of colonized subordinate people. This is, I quote from Britannica 2026. The spatiality of colonial project intersects with landscape. After all, coveting land is an essential aspect of the colonial occupation. There is as well the intangible, which is the subordination, dehumanizing indigenous, often killing them, not even beyond that. But most of all, colonialism undermines the relationship the indigenous people have to that land, to that environment. This is best put in the words of Amitav Ghosh, who compares two worldviews, that of the colonizer and the colonized. So for the indigenous population, landscape was a place of dwelling that was enmeshed with human life in ways that were imaginative as well as real and material, and the combined living spirits of plants, animals, water, human histories, and events. So a very, very rich and layered relationship. The colonizer, on the other hand, the ideology was one of conquest, of subjugating human beings, and everything they surveyed and mapped, even in their own countries, and especially within the domain they conceived of as nature. So nature was rendered inert, a resource to use, a repository of resources, which in order to be improved needed to be expropriated and exploited. And in this lies really the root of the ecological crisis that we endure today. At the same time, when we look at the conceptual discourse of the colonial legacy as a metaphor, it implies meaning of landscape as a hegemonic, a particular way of seeing that is rooted in the emergent capitalist world of Western Europe. And you can see in the painting from Gainsborough, the distant landscape, this romanticized, naturalistic landscape with copses and woodlands and sheep, and a picture from New Zealand, the landscape that was colonized, which is not much different. And Blaustein, which I quote, talks very cleverly about this. He talks about the double movement of colonizing landscape and landscaping colonies, where landscape was first used to colonize the European countryside, because the act of enclosure and everything that happened started in Europe before it was transported to the colonies, where landscape was then, became a way to shape these places that were appropriated and colonized. So what is the problem with this? Dang talks, there is a lot of talk about the colonial legacy and decolonizing, but it's not in landscape architecture. It comes from geographers who use landscape, and we've learned a lot from geography, really, from the discourse in geography. So Blaustein talks about the problem is that the historical hegemonic meaning of landscape is steeped in the logics of colonialism and racial capitalism, making its analysis politically fraught and methodologically challenging. This hegemonic way of beholding the world is limiting and limited. It cripples, in a way, this amazing concept of landscape. And this is more or less what those geographers are saying. And I quote also at the bottom Barbara Bender. In the end, this colonial legacy, all we need to do, she says, to colonize, is not to take for granted the historical roots, this pictorial hegemonic view, and to pause and think exactly what the landscape should encompass, for whom it is being mobilized as a concept, and what, in fact, it masks as a spatial concept. So to question, to look at what landscape means to me here, or wherever I am, the person, just to question and not to take for granted. I think this is mainly the message. So that's a metaphor, but the colonial legacy is a reality. It's not a metaphor when you come to the global south, where territories and people were colonized. And here, I will focus on Southwest Asia and North Africa, what the colonialists referred to as the Middle East. I try as much as I can not to use the word Middle East, but it creeps in and people understand it, so I end up using it, unfortunately. So the aim here really is to look at what happened when we were colonized. And after the First World War, these regions were occupied by Europeans, mainly British and French. But the colonization was different from that in Americas, in Australia, or in New Zealand. It was not a settler colonialism, except for Palestine, where the British gave it to establish the State of Israel, which is a settler colonial state. And in Algeria, the French did settle that. But for the rest of the Middle East and for this region, the key was the extraction of resources, oil, which is still the problem up to now. So that was, so in a sense, the landscape wasn't shaped to look like the romanticized English landscape. Something much more, I think, sinister happened. What was introduced was the concept of nation states. The region was divided into nation states, which are centralized political organizations that facilitated colonial rule and served as tools to modernize colonial lands. The colonial assumption was that the colonized were unable to participate fully in a modernizing society. But unlike nation states in Europe, which evolved, the nation states in these regions, colonized regions, were imposed. They made their boundaries, or how they were put together, made very little sense. What existed before these? What was there before the nation states? There was city-states, and city-states, or the vilayet, the Ottoman vilayet. City-states have been a concept of governance and organization, spatial organization, since Sumerian times, 4,000 years ago. And what it really does, you look at the Ottoman map to the left, you have the vilayet of Aleppo, of Baghdad, of Damascus. So it's really cities, a mother city, with its hinterland, villages, towns, and there was a kind of a synergy between the city and between rural and urban, both economic, political, social, cultural. It was quite an independent entity. And then when the nation states were created, all of that was broken. And I will stop here to share a slide from a Lebanese architect, Karl Sharrow, who does a parody on these divisions. And he says, the divisions of the boundaries or the borders of the nation state are as nonsensical as what he shows. So he says 6 new ways to divide the Middle East and North Africa. So you have genes and traditional. You have oil, the lower arid parts, and olive oil, the Mediterranean, and so on, kings, generals, other. So it is as nonsensical as this portrayal. Another thing that happened was that if we look at how the land changed, from that decentered Ottoman cellular organization to a centralized rule. And what is in the middle of the centralized rule? Capital cities. And capital cities, if you look to the global south, are really the key places that are problematic because it was the place where modernity was showcased, and this is where landscape appears. It is a place where there are services, where there are jobs, so people, of course, gravitated towards capital cities. In the end, two things happened. Capital cities suffered, and the countryside was depleted. Another thing happened is that rural traditional practices were denigrated in favor of modernity. They were the antithesis of modernity. And we lost a lot of these inspirational practices and traditional vernacular concepts through this. So there is finally another aspect to colonialism. The nation state continued as a governance after colonialism in post-colonial nationalist government. So it was the same system of governance, and it was the same production of knowledge. It was the same educational system with all sorts of biases. The colonial bias is insidious. It's all over. It took me 40 years to realize that there is a colonial legacy, and I am part of it, because for a very long time I just thought, well, the West, no, they've produced the knowledge, and we just don't have it. I just didn't see what it was, and it's just in the last few years that I realized this. In a conference, very, very interesting conference, one I think of its first at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University, was a conference organized by Gareth Doherty, faculty in the landscape, African landscape architectures. The S was intentional. And again, you find the insidious bias, Western bias existing there. So a lot, what came out was that they were calling for a reverse, to reverse the colonial logic by which Western models had long been imposed onto African settings, and that the growth of academic programs also needs to be matched by the development of an African-centric academic curriculum, not a Eurocentric, but this, the Eurocentric one continues. Finally, what Elise referred to, there is no words in Arabic translation for landscape. It's impossible to translate landscape. But the word that exists is mandar tabi'i, which is natural scenery. So it's a meaning stuck in the past. And that, up to the present, is the definition of landscape. So, of course, this is problematic because, not only because it naturalizes this hegemonic, distant, contemplative view, this human beings being at the center and seeing this landscape as a natural scenery, but it seeps into professional practice, and it limits professional practice to beautification, because if it's about, and in fact, outlined in red, landscape architecture, I'll translate, it says to put buildings in an area so that the view is beautiful. So this is what people looking up landscape find. So to explain just how this works, I will go to Damascus. I always like to cite this example. I was a landscape architecture consultant for the Damascus master plan between 2009 and 2012, just before the insurgency. And I worked with Khatib and Alami, a Lebanese consultancy firm. So I was told, you're the landscape architect? Okay. This is your scope of work. You will work on the landscape of the city. on cemeteries, on parks, sports, and green verges. That is your scope of work. Okay, I accepted that. But after a week in Damascus, going around, talking to people, understanding and experiencing this amazing city, I realized they had missed the 3 most iconic landscapes that define Damascus, namely Mount Kasyoun, part of the Kalamoun range, which towers over the city in the plain, wherever you go in the city, the Barada River, which cuts through the mountain range, the Kalamoun, and bifurcates into 7 tributaries. The entire city, the bathhouses, the residential quarters were built on these tributaries. So it is the essence, it's the living spine of the city. But it was absent from the GIS maps that were given to me. So it wasn't even thought of. And finally, this halo of green that encloses Damascus, encircles it, which is the Ghouta, which agriculture, productive landscape of orchards, amazing, beautiful place. So I went back to the client and said, look, okay, I will work with parks and everything, but these 3 components are the main landscape. They define the identity and culture. They loved it. They said, yes, of course. I said, I want to include them. They said, yes, please include them. Why didn't they think of them? Because landscape, the word that came from the West, is associated with the landscape in the city, the Western-style landscape of parks and tree-lined boulevards. So they didn't think of it. Eventually, it became not only it was considered, but it became the foundation for developing the urban strategies and the master plan in Damascus. I will not go through that. So what we need really, going back to this Damascus example, is grounding research and practice. In other words, turning our face from always looking to the West to look at what we have, what is there. And grounding is really grounded or embodied or immersive. I use them interchangeably. I know there are differences and some will disagree. But this kind of knowledge results from actively engaging perception and cognition, body and mind, as researchers learn through first-hand observation and interaction with their surroundings. Another aim of grounding is because grounded and embodied research is one way to counter the colonial legacy and steer designers away from the pictorial, visual meaning of landscape by fostering empathy, respect, and cultural sensitivity towards local communities and their traditions. And I like very much the work of philosopher Michael Polanyi, who his book on tacit knowing, he says that we know more than we know what we know. So we always understand the place and we internalize it. So he says that it is not by looking at things, but by dwelling in them that we understand their joint meanings. So grounded and embedded also comes from anthropology, and it's it's a methodology that is used. And now it is increasingly being used in architecture and in landscape architecture. And Gareth Doherty's book, Landscape Fieldwork, is really an incredible work. It is excellent. And he says that if the goal of landscape architecture is to serve users more fully, we can't do so without landscape fieldwork. That is without an open-ended approach that has the space to be emotional and rational, qualitative and quantitative. He talks about, from ethnography, anthropology, of course, is descriptive. But when designers are grounded and embedded in the landscape, they read the landscape, but their work is also prescriptive, because as designers, we create. So in a sense, it's a very powerful way of developing designs. Going back to my own experience, I didn't know any of all of this, as I said. So for me, ecology was an incredible way to understand landscape and to look at how complex it is, holistic, it is integrative, and it is dynamic. And so when we published the book, again, there was no talk of colonial legacy. Gloria Punchetti, my good colleague, and I published our thesis, PhD thesis, and it was really, we both were suffering from the imposition of North European planning strategies and management onto Mediterranean context, which was totally inappropriate, and it just didn't work. So this is one of the reasons why we put our works together and wrote the book. So for me, it was marrying ecology and design. And I go back to that diagram I showed you. I showed you the limited version of how I understood landscape. With ecology, this is how that conceptual diagram is transformed. Landscape is this dynamic relationship, ever evolving between people and the environment they inhabit, is continuous, both spatially and temporally. There are no cuts. Landscapes flow in time and in space. So when you look to the past, they have come from a past, sometimes that is a heritage landscape. They go to the future, where landscape becomes a platform for developing better futures. And at the same time, spatially, we move from the regional or the ecosphere, in fact, all the way down to the local. So this systems approach, this dynamic view, impacts the way we understand landscape and the way we practice. So now I would like to move to one very small example for the rest of the lecture of a project from southern Lebanon in Iblis Sa'i, the village of Iblis Sa'i. This is a project that was developed by ESCWA, Economic Social Commission, UN, Economic and Social Commission in West Asia, as a post-Israeli occupation recovery. Because Israel had occupied southern Lebanon. Unfortunately, it's still occupying once more. So when there was liberation in 2000, there were projects to recover this different villages and the landscape itself. So I was approached by them because the United Nations peacekeeping force, UNIFIL, IMBAT, Indian Battalion, had approached them saying that, look, there is a forest, and this is an exceptional feature because all forests and orchards much of them were raised during occupation because they're hiding places, and so to clear the view. So Iblis Sa'i woodland remained because the UNIFIL were based in the village. So here you can see the woodland, and to the right, the village. So the Indian Battalion said, look, now that the occupation is over, let's do something in this woodland. Let's do a landscape, bring some flower pots, put some swings so the community can use it. And it was a wonderful gesture. So I was approached to do these things. It's a beautiful, southern Lebanon is a beautiful landscape. It's hilly, and you can see in the distance Mount Hermon. This is a view from the part of the forest. The forest is partially wooded. The rest is open scrubland. And there is also the spring and olive orchards that are very much valued by the people. of Iblis. It was a small project, but still, I was then at AUB, and I put together a team of agriculturists, of ecologists, of GIS expert, architect, landscape, and we all worked on the concept of what to do with this woodland. We met with the local community, with the municipality to understand what they need, and worked with them, surveyed the landscape. GIS maps were created, and you can see in the dark green to the right, this is the part that is wooded. The lighter green next to it is really scrubland. So I applied the ecological approach, and basically this methodology of trying to locate ecological landscape associations, I told them, so clusters that have similar characteristics, both ecological and spatial. And 3 zones were identified. Zone 1 was the wooded part that you saw in the picture. Zone 2 is in red is the open scrubland, and it is so important. There are no trees, but that's where biodiversity is. As you all know, I mean, you don't have biodiversity under the trees, but in open scrublands, that's the Mediterranean biodiversity. And the 3rd zone was the riparian zone, the river zone. It's the Hasbani River that goes all the way down to Israel. So you have these 3 zones that have very different ecological characteristics. That was the basis for the design. The significance of this kind of was, the project was completed. I will go to the design in a short while. The projects were auctioned, and Mercy Corps in American US Mercy Corps took the Ibil project and commissioned it to SPNL, which is the Society for Protection of Nature in Lebanon. What they did, they took those zones and showed that they serve as different bird habitats, and used this to approach BirdLife International to declare the whole woodland as an important bird area. So this was incredible because of this kind of the approach. It was Hema Ibil, it was declared an IBA, and the declaration is important because it restores confidence and the dignity of people after occupation. It is as important as building houses. So they were so proud that Ibil has its own, IBA, so. And even more ironic is they love hunting in Lebanon. They hunt birds, and it's so sad because it's on the migratory routes, and it's horrible, but they do. But the good news is that the same hunters served as guides to bird watching because they know where the birds are, what they do, what they eat, how they fly. So in a sense, it was very important because you secured livelihoods, alternative livelihoods, which is a key when you go to the Global South. Another outcome, this is more or less the plan that we submitted. There was 5, a multi-purpose area. This is not a design that's beautiful, and it's just a very simple idea of putting stuff together. So there is a multi-purpose space. There's also, I proposed a small building, which is like a science and orientation center for, that's just a room for students and schools and so on. There was one other component, which I will talk about now, but take note of that red circle and Hema Ibil, because I will talk about that as well. So one of the things that the people of Iblis kept talking about was, Beit al-Fallah, Beit al-Fallah. Beit al-Fallah is a folkloric house that was in the village of how farmers, what was the house of a farmer like in the 19th century. So, of course, the house had been ruined during the war. It was burned. But fortunately, Frederick Raguet, who was the Dean of Architecture at American University of Beirut, had archived the building. So a dear colleague of mine, Hana Alameddin, was commissioned by Mercy Corps, Ma'mari, her practice, to recreate it. And it was recreated at the entrance of that multi-purpose space. And it was quite a project because it was built with adobe, with mud, and with wood, and technologies, building technologies that had been lost. So in a sense, Hannah had to work to rediscover it, to find in other villages who knew to come. And in the end, it was built. And you can see here it's completed. And in the distance is the main center and the open space. And again, it was such a, the pride of Iblis Sa'i, because it had this Beit al-Fallah. And it's a very interesting folkloric part of their past. Now, that word I told you about, Hima, the word Hima, H-I-M-A, was these maps, the maps I used were French colonial maps. And the French were amazing in documenting all place names, everything that happened there in the vernacular. So there was this Hima. And when we researched Hima, Hima is a pre-Islamic concept of nature conservation that existed in Arabia, in the Arabian and the region, the whole region. And so SPNL, the Society for Protection of Nature in Lebanon, because this is what they work with, approached IUCN and asked that they recognize Hima as a community-led conservation, nature conservation. So this was really an incredible thing. And imagine, from this map, this name on the map, now if you Google the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, you will find Hima listed. And so this was, again, another important achievement. So finally, the final part is many of the villagers and the town people came to me and said, why are you dealing with the forest? The woodland is nothing. Why don't you look at our olive orchards? They are really beautiful. These are what the landscape worth seeing. So when the project finished, I wanted to go back and find out, is there a landscape without the word landscape? And that is the ethnographic research that I did in Iblis Sa'i. I'll go very quickly through this. But basically, I did the survey without using the word landscape. I couldn't use it because it would skew the study. So what I did is I used the words of the landscape components, the woodland, the olive orchards, the spring, and so on, and asked, which do you visit, which do you prefer, which one represents your town? So there was a functional aspect. Like all rural communities, farmers are very practical people. And one of the interviewees said, I love the one that benefits me most. If the olives are there, they always give me income and olive oil and olives. But if, for example, you do something with the woodland that will bring money to the village, then I will like the woodlands. So in a sense, they're very practical and dysfunctional, but there is an amazing attachment to the olives. There's also a very strong sense of nature and environment, both implicit in clean air and beautiful surroundings, natural contact with nature, but also explicit. They harvest nature. This is wild asparagus and all sorts of herbs that they collect. And I'll read the quote just from a young girl. She says, with the first rain, we go to the olive orchards to collect snails and ba'li, cress. This is hindba. This is haba, again, sage, all sorts of plants. This plant is poisonous, the other is not. Mother knows which is which. I often forget, but mother reminds me. So it shows how these traditions and this attachment to nature and the land is transmitted from one generation to another. There's also a very strong spatiality in the perception of their surroundings, which are water-related, landform-related, agriculture-related, and so I listed the place names. So in a sense, I like this project because I think it is a small project, insignificant, but because it was not formalistic, I didn't put the swings and flower beds that they asked for. But what we did propose carried through beyond the scope of the project, and that is a very important thing. So I come to the end, more or less, of my talk. I started by saying that I practice started in a void. And there is, as you can see from the International Federation of Landscape Architects map, there is a void. All the light gray are countries that don't have representation, neither as individual nor as an association. The light green is individual members. So this has changed. In the 4 years, I just stepped down as president of International Federation of Landscape Architects Middle East region. Fortunately, Middle East was stuck there. So we created the Jordanian Society, the Saudi, and the Omani. And today I met 2 young, wonderful Iraqi landscape architects, graduates of the Daniel faculty, and I hope we can make an Iraqi society. So this void that I found myself in when I started in the 80s, of course, was a challenge, but it was also a blessing because I was not forced into mainstream practice. There was no mainstream. So in a sense, I was free to shape landscape any way I wanted it, to intersect it with human rights, to look at landscape and sustainable urban greening, to look at post-war recovery, to look at heritage. What is landscape heritage? So all of these amazing potentialities of landscape architecture, I was free to explore. Sometimes I fell, sometimes it didn't work, sometimes it did. And another thing I discovered was that our role also, first of all, that this approach, this landscape approach, is not the domain of landscape architecture. I keep saying this. It is the domain of whoever wants to take this landscape approach, which is holistic, dynamic, integrative of people and environment. Architects, planners, as you saw. So this is also very important. I'm very proud that with Selma Samaha and another 3, Naila, Al-Aqal, Salwa Sabbar, and Maria Gabriella Trovato, we established the Lebanese Landscape Association, LELA, the first IFLA ratified association in the Arab world. And in this conference in 2016, you can find the 6 themes of the conference try to expand landscape beyond the pictorial and its faulty translation. I end with the most recent challenge. Tamayuz, one way of advancing the profession of landscape architecture is really to look to architects and convert them. So I have this insidious agenda, just like I was converted. So to do that, one of the ways to do that is to reach out. And Tamayuz Award in the top, Tamayuz Award, Excellence Award for Architecture, started in Iraq and is now an international award, very much followed and recognized. And so they asked, would you want to have the theme of landscape in the Rifat Chaderchi Prize of 20? I said yes. And the theme I chose was the theme of the book I published with Shelley Goes and Gloria, The Right to Landscape, to look at one village in southern Lebanon which was heavily destroyed, but not, the agenda was not to reconstruct the village, but to go to the agricultural valley, the Sahel, which is really the source of their livelihoods and a place of reprieve where they escape to from their destroyed village. And so we have to wait until next fall when the results will be coming in, but I'm intrigued to see what sort of interventions will come out of this. Thank you.
So thank you so very much, Jala, for that talk. It's amazing to hear about landscape from a context of having to explain to many people what landscape is. Yesterday we had some interim thesis reviews for our landscape students, and one of the things we're often talking about when we're talking to students about how they speak about their projects is how when you move on to practice, you're often having to sometimes change the way you talk about a project depending on your audience, because you often are having to educate your client or the community or the group that you're working with. So obviously, education of everyone you're working with has been a huge factor in all of your work. And I'm curious, you've shown us some successes, but are most people receptive to this other way of thinking about a word that they have certain associations with, or have you had pushback, challenges?
Yes, I have. Yesterday in the class I spoke of for another project where I was invited as a consultant for environment and ecology, no landscape. And when I suggested, it was an EU-funded project about side and greening, and I said, let's introduce landscape, environment, and ecology. And the person in charge said, no, please, please, this is a serious project. You can't bring in landscape, again, because of a limited perception of landscape. So I said, okay, let me give it a try in the first phase. If you feel it is not suitable, then I will not use it. I'll go back to ecology and environment. And of course, yes, it worked. So yes, but you said it, Elise. It's how you reach out to the client. You really need to see what do they care for, what is important. And if they see, if you can capture their, what they care for, they will be convinced in the end, I think.
The birds is such a beautiful example of that. You can't necessarily get the appreciation for the soil, the rocks, the flora.
Absolutely.
But as soon as we introduce the fauna, suddenly that's proof that it has value. I'm fascinated with that story. I guess one of the other things that you spoke about a little bit, and I'm wondering if you could maybe give us some examples, is you talked a bit about some of the vernacular methodology that has to be returned kind of architecturally. Are there examples that are more rooted in ecology and land-based practices that you've been able to draw on?
Yeah. In fact, this whole idea of colonial legacy came from looking at rural gardens. Because for me, the landscape of a garden was so fundamentally different from the rural garden that it hit me that why was I thinking this way? And the hakura, which I've spoken about, and is really a garden orchard, and it is exactly the description of the garden in the Quran, in the Bible, where there is one of every kind, and it is useful to people, because in such arid ecologies, you can't afford to have something ornamental. What the little water and good soil you have, you want to use productively so that you can benefit from it. So it's very much a productive garden. And I've learned a lot from that conception. That is when I was aware that I am part of this bias. I was looking at the total landscape, the rural landscape, and aware of traditional practices. Again, you keep learning. But with the garden, it was just very, very clear. So yes, and you learn. And the language. I found out recently, again, I spoke of this yesterday, that the word for garden is jnaina. It's a diminutive of Jannah. Jannah is paradise. And when I looked at the root of Jannah, of paradise, the Arabic word, it comes from the same root as embryo, janeen, or heart, something that is sheltered. So imagine, a garden is sheltered because it would not survive otherwise. So look at how much we can learn by looking at the vernacular language and looking at practices and what they value and how they, I think it's, and this is just a few examples, but I'm sure there's so much more from all over.
And would you say that most of those practices still do exist in the more rural areas?
Yes. Oh, yes, they do. They do. I know in Lebanon, where I spent the last 20 years, yes, a lot of it exists. And even in Iraq, in parts of Iraq, I'm sure there is. But we're so focused on cities. We have to go out because really we talked about the colonial legacy, but cities globalize, they're Western, they look to the West. But rural culture is much more in tune with the ecology, with the land, with the needs. And so for inspiration and to learn, we need to go back and visit these. And you have amazing examples also of the first people, the indigenous population of Canada. And again, their worldview is so very different from ours. And so, I really believe that is the way, grounding, and that is one way of really learning. Yeah.
I have a feeling I'll be using the term grounding a lot more often now. I could chat with you all day, but I know that we've got a lot of people in the audience who probably have some interesting things to say. So I don't know if we have a microphone that's moving around, if we've got somebody up here. There we go, great.
Yeah, thank you. As a preliminary, I'd be interested to know what work you did in Baghdad. But the real question I wanted to pose is, could you comment on the degree of environmental desecration in these areas, or are these pristine landscapes? Pardon the use of the word, but what is the status of the environment when you move into these areas?
Poor.
I would call, environmental desecration is what I'm reading.
Yeah.
And how does that work into your projects?
There's two things, environment and nature. These are problematic because when people are desperate for work, for livelihoods, they don't care about the environment. It's impossible. I'd rather feed my kids than, think of how pristine the environment is. The same with nature. Landscape architecture plays a role there because if it is community-driven and if really your care is about people, then you find ways of framing the environment, protecting the environment, and protecting nature that is beneficial. You reframe it I'll give you an example. In Sidon, it was about urban greening, and all of Lebanon, you have, throughout the Mediterranean, dry water courses, which are very important because it's an ecological entity. It's footprints of nature, even if there is no water, for most of the year. But what happens is, because it belongs to the state, it's state property, rivers, they locate the sewage network in these dry water courses. The sewage networks break. These streams then are polluted, and then they cover them and put them underground. Every spring, when the rains come, they flood, destroy. So to frame this is an environmental problem, both the river itself, which is a degraded ecosystem, but it pours into the sea, to the Mediterranean. So the way we framed it was really to look at these streams, to recognize them, first of all. And everybody in the municipality, who were the client at the time, said, yeah, these are just sewers. What do you want to do with them? But we proposed to have them as greenways. Remove the sewage, put it next to it, and reclaim the river. But this is another problem, because the duration of the project is 2 years. Okay. What do you do in 2 years? But because it was a participatory approach, other groups took up this challenge. They worked with one of the rivers, and it was to reclaim this river, Amli River, in Sidon. They succeeded. They got even more funding from EU to continue the project. So this is an environmental problem that was framed through a landscape, as a landscape. This is the best I can see. Another is the example of the village, the IBA, the important bird area. It brought livelihoods, because it created jobs for the people. Tourists would come to watch birds, they'd eat in the restaurant, they'd live. So again, it's nature conservation, but it has been framed differently. So we don't have the money, we don't have the resources to do nature conservation on its own, nor to care for the environment on its own. You have to learn how to package it. So, and landscape architecture, I think, is a very good way of doing that. I don't know if I've answered your question. Yes? Did you?
No, I didn't. Could you describe your work in Baghdad?
My work in Baghdad? That's a long time ago. Yeah, I worked in Baghdad a long time. I was much more of an architect, and I did the master plan also with Khatib and Alemi for Baghdad. But I'd love to go back anyway. Yeah.
Thank you so much for an amazing, inspiring talk. I have a question about language and the role of language and how it plays in the literacy of a landscape. So you did give the example of the Janneh and Jnene, and I'm wondering if over time our literacy or understanding of the landscape is severed as language changes. So, vernacular, the use of words to describe and read a landscape and live in it and inhabit it over time, whether if you're living in the city or as people stop speaking the language, if the loss of language also has a connection with the loss of people in their landscape. And at the same time, how the landscape was very much a part of everything. The singing,
Yes.
the dancing,
Yeah.
the embroidery on clothes had
Yes,
something
absolutely.
to do with what plants were grown or disease. So over time, as you lose a culture, you can also lose your connection to a landscape. And I'm wondering, how much would you say a landscape architect or a designer or the literacy of landscape can come back as a form of restoration as well? And if you have an example that you can point to that connects these things with each other.
Yeah, it's a very good question. And yeah, I agree. But again, we go back to what Barbara Bender said, that the quotation I put, that let's ask, what is this landscape? Who is it for? Why is it there? What does it mean to the people? like you said, in Palestinian embroidering, you find all the landscape features of the landscape in each motif and color they choose, which is amazing. Okay, they don't have paintings. The paintings is not part of our culture. But you find this, how do you use that to arrive at this cultural perception specific to this group? So I think that's it. I mean, when I talk about the colonial legacy, it's just a question, not to take it for granted, but to keep looking to what is the meaning of landscape. I still believe in landscape. I believe it's an incredible idea. It's not a word, it's an idea, it's a concept. It's so rich, and there's so much in it, but we have to be careful, yeah.
Would you say, I can't tell if I'm on or off. I think I'm on now. I'm off. Oh, now I'm on. Okay. So would you say that you've been able to see any of that, any type of cultural resurgence as a result of your projects? I know we never get to spend the time with the projects that may take, but have you witnessed anything where you would say some of that landscape connection has engendered more of a cultural response?
I can't talk about a response, but I know that when you represent landscape in this different way that I'm talking about, you then influence the client, you influence, I won't say the local community, because the local community, I'm learning from them. They're the ones influencing me. But you also influence colleagues. And this is why I write. You have to write, because if you don't write, then these experiences have to be documented. And so you have to practice, you teach, you write. And every small step makes a little bit of a difference. We're still stuck with no words. But one of the words that, if I had a choice, I mean, that is closest to landscape in Arabic is place. And anthropology, Christopher Tilly talks so much about landscape and place, and the overlap of the two. And in Arabic, we have a beautiful word for makan. And it's clear, people know it, understand it. So, as I said, through practice, making people aware of the potential of landscape, and also looking to the language. I wish my command of Arabic was better, but again, it's to look for this concept. Arabic is an amazing language. It invents a word for every single technological, new technologies that didn't exist. But you need to know what landscape is, and you need to know the language. So I know the landscape. I don't know the languages that well.
I think it looked like somebody was ready for a question here.
Hi. So one of the questions I wanted to ask especially is, because this project was developed in southern Lebanon, especially what was happening at that time and currently now with the occupation, do you think religion, like maybe Islam, Judaism, or Christianity, do you think that influences the way it shapes the landscape and like how people plan out landscapes specifically, even going back in time before?
Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry. I think I'll start
I will
getting hearing aids, because I have a problem hearing.
I'll try to paraphrase,
Yes.
and you can correct me if I'm
Yeah.
wrong. But it's a question really about how religion and the
Yeah.
different kinds of occupation and things that are going on
Yeah.
at the moment of these projects
Yeah.
starts to influence either how projects are
Yeah.
developed or how they're received.
Yeah, I got the part about religion. The thing is that the Middle East is a very, very diverse region, both ethnically and religiously, not just religiously. And yes, yeah, there are some clashes between ethnicities, but in general, people make do, when there isn't an outside influence. However, again, an advantage of landscape is that we deal with nature and with ecology. And when it comes to nature and environment, they all agree. Even politically, you know, when you talk about landscape, or not landscape, but environment and nature, people accept what you say because it's neutral, you know. I'm not talking about social and economic and political. So I think, again, landscape can play a role through the work that we do to bring people together. But yeah, there are, you know, wherever there is diversity. The thing is that instead of celebrating diversity in the Middle East, it has become a problem. And that is, I think, very, very sad. Don't know that I answered.
Thank you for such a great lecture. It's always so wonderful to see Arab voices in architecture and landscape architecture industries. And I guess my question is related to not just now, but over the decades, the same Western entities that grant regions in Southwest Asia and North Africa, the same institutions that grant us UNESCO and heritage labels are part of the same countries and same organizations that are responsible for their destruction. So I guess my question is, similarly to how you're using language to reframe the way that people in those regions understand how landscape interacts with everyday life, have you guys been discussing any ways to decenter the West more as we go forward, especially just looking at how little respect they have for these areas?
Thank you. Yeah, it's a very good question. I think the answer is not just in our region. Again, I spoke about this yesterday. There has been what I call a paradigm shift in the way environment is conceptualized. You're right. Environment was really looked upon as resources, and it was regulated through IUCN, looking at nature and natural resources, or even heritage, looking at cultural heritage through UNESCO and so on. And these global or international institutions made global treaties, and countries became signatories to biodiversity conservation or protected areas or whatever, and that filtered down slowly. By the time it got to people, it meant nothing. It was just very abstract, one. Two, the role of the designer was, what do we do? I mean, it's coming from above. So it is top-heavy, as you said, whether it's coming mostly from the West. The new paradigm is different. Environment is different. And you can see all over what happened here in Canada a while back and what Naomi Klein talks about. It is very much bottom-up. Environment is no longer resources. It is about livelihoods. It's about identity. It's a heritage. And so this stirs communities to react so that, because they want to protect their livelihoods and their heritage and their attachment or whatever. And they dictate, not always, but they put their foot down and they can make a voice. The role of the designer changes, the architect, because when this is happening, the designer, architect, landscape architect, urban designer, can intervene and become the facilitator to translate these needs and requirements to donor agencies or to municipalities or regional governments. So I really think that changes the formula that you are, because yes, it is very much dictated by the West. But between this shift in the way we see environment and between being grounded and with the community, yes, changes can happen, I think.
Okay, well, I
maybe
think that
there's a
actually,
question
I'm not sure if can we have one more? Okay.
Thanks for the lecture. I think a lot of people asked a lot of good questions, especially with the language, and then going back to Arabic language, which is one of the oldest language. You've also mentioned like a lot of things about the indigenous way. You've also talked about the garden and then landscape. I think that when a garden is a self-sustaining entity, it's an intelligent thing, and landscape is more of a human intervention thing that requires human interference and does not have necessarily the same level of intelligence as a garden that's thriving on its own wood. Plants get diseased, things like that, and they're able to like heal themselves. I noticed on the map where there was a void of the countries that are not part of whatever this landscape movement is, are more so the natural countries that are still like, they have their forests and they don't intervene with the forest, they don't challenge nature in terms of like providing for themselves, they just let nature provide and they go into the seasons and gather whatever has been provided by these landscapes. So do you think perhaps the void on that map are actually countries that are smart enough to not challenge nature and not try to promote landscape as natural? Thank you.
Thank you. Gosh, you've demolished my whole talk. Yes and no. Yeah, I see the point. The void was countries that didn't recognize the profession yet. And yes, you are right. We can do some damage, I'm sure we have done damage. But at the same time, it's not about design and making, it's about how you manage. And most of my work is in arid regions. And in arid regions, you cannot just let nature takes over its desertification, a lot of the cases. So you have to. People knew exactly how to intervene and where to intervene. You're right there. Yes, people know how to, because they didn't have the technology, they didn't have the science. So they had no choice but to sustain the environment that sustains them. So yes, you have a point there. But you cannot always, it doesn't always work. You really need to intervene and to do so in a modest way, to learn from those people what they do. And also the lesson of ecology, the main lesson I remember is not to predict, but to anticipate. We can never predict. Nature, you can never predict. And the whole dynamic is, changing. So you anticipate something and you work with the communities. That's the best I can say. But yes, you're right. Sometimes the work we do is destructive and it can cause damage. I hope not always. I hope that's the lesson.
Well, and I think it probably does come down again to this idea of the relationship that we as humans have. And I think,
Yes.
You've done an amazing way of reminding us that very often this has been a domineering idea about man's dominion over nature, humans taking charge and transforming it for their own purposes. Whereas I'd like to think all of us being educated in landscape architecture today, and certainly all the amazing work that you're doing, is really reminding us that we are a part of a much larger system, a much larger set of systems and ecologies, and we have to work with those because they are far more powerful than we are.
Absolutely.
Thank you
Very
so
well.
much for this evening. Thank you for your talk. It's been fantastic.
Thank you.
I do have a few other things I have to mention before I'm able to let you all go. I just need to remind everyone of our future talks that are happening in the public programming lecture. On the 10th, we'll be having the Vega Foundation and Power Plant Contemporary Art Galleries Association bringing together a visual studies public lecture with Lucy Raven. And that will be coming, like I said, on March 10th. And then on the 12th, we'll have a screening of William H. Holly White's 1980 film, The Social Life of Small Urban Spaces, followed by a panel discussion. So we hope to see many of you there at these events. And again, I'm just so very thankful for all of you coming out tonight and for Jala making the trip to come and see us and share all of her efforts with us. Thank you.